For years, scientists believed the story of the Filipino people was simple. Their DNA was thought to come mostly from Austronesian farmers, seafarers who sailed down from Taiwan about 4,000 years ago. A neat migration, a single origin, a tidy explanation. But that version of history, it's been completely shattered by recent genetic evidence. Hidden inside the blood of modern Filipinos are fragments of a forgotten world, dark-skinned hunter-gatherers who arrived over 50,000 years ago. Mysterious traces of an extinct human cousin called the Denisovans, echoes from Polynesian voyagers, Chinese merchants, Arab traders, Spanish conquistadors, and even faint genetic whispers that reach all the way to Siberia. Some of these genes shouldn't be here, and yet they are. Not only here, but preserved, surviving untouched in remote mountain villages, forest tribes, and island communities for tens of thousands of years. This is a story of survival and extinction, of migrations we never recorded, of people who vanished. From history, but not from the gene pool. So what makes Filipino DNA so strange? How did it become one of the most complex genetic tapestries in the world? And what can it tell us about who Filipinos really are, and where they truly came from? The story of the Filipino people doesn't begin with kingdoms or sails on the horizon. It begins deep inside caves, where fragments of bone whisper of lives lived tens of thousands of years ago. Not myths, not legends, but real people, hidden for millennia beneath limestone and soil. In 2007, inside the cliffs of Calao Cave in northern Luzon, archaeologist Armand Majares and his team uncovered a tiny foot bone, just 61 millimeters long. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but it turned out to belong to a species no one had ever seen before. They called it Homo luzonensis, a new branch of the human family tree, small in size with curved finger and toe bones suggesting climbing ability, and a mix of features from both modern humans and much older ancestors. The discovery shook the scientific world. Here was evidence that the Philippines was not just a stopover, but a stage for humanity's deep evolutionary story. But Homo luzonensis was not alone. Far to the south, in Palawan, caves held the remains of another early inhabitant, Taban man. Discovered in the 1960s, these skull fragments and jawbones are at least 30,000 years old, proof that early humans roamed the Philippines long before recorded history. And yet, even these bones are not the whole story. Genetic evidence tells us that modern Filipinos carry traces of another long-lost cousin, the Denisovans. Unlike the more famous Neanderthals, Denisovans left almost no fossils, but they left their mark in DNA, and nowhere is that legacy stronger than in the Philippines. Among the Aita, Agta, and other indigenous peoples of Luzon, scientists have found Denisovan ancestry levels higher than anywhere else on Earth. It's a stunning clue, suggesting that tens of thousands of years ago, Denisovans interbred with the ancestors of today's Filipinos. Some of their genes even shaped survival, influencing traits like resistance to disease and adaptation to heat and altitude. So what did life look like for these first Filipinos? They were hunter-gatherers, moving through dense rainforests, fishing along river mouths, and climbing the jagged mountains that rise straight from the sea. Tools made of stone and bone show they hunted deer, wild pigs, and even giant animals, now extinct. In coastal caves, shells piled up into ancient middens, the leftovers of countless meals shared around flickering fires. Survival was never easy. Typhoons ripped across the islands, earthquakes shook the land, and volcanic eruptions could wipe out entire communities. But these early people adapted. They learned to move with the seasons, to harvest both land and sea, to carve out life in a landscape as dangerous as it was rich. Their world was isolated, yet connected. The islands of the Philippines were never one single landmass. Even in the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, deep trenches kept many islands apart. This forced early humans to become some of the world's first seafarers, crossing treacherous channels long before the invention of large boats. Every crossing left a legacy. Some groups stayed on one island. Others spread to many, creating a patchwork of cultures and dialects. Over tens of thousands of years, isolation preserved diversity. That's why even today the Philippines has more than 180 distinct languages, a living echo of that ancient fragmentation. And then there were those who vanished. The bones of Homo luzonensis suggest a people who lived, thrived, and disappeared, leaving only a few fragments in a cave. We don't know why they went extinct. Perhaps they were absorbed into later populations. Perhaps climate or competition pushed them to the edge. But their presence reminds us the Philippines was not just settled once, but again and again, layer upon layer. Modern Filipinos carry this hidden history in their blood. Geneticists can trace lineages back to these ancient hunter-gatherers, especially among indigenous groups in the mountains and forests. It means that while civilizations rose and fell, while colonizers came and went, echoes of the very first Filipinos never disappeared. To stand in Calao Cave today is to stand at the threshold of forgotten worlds. The dripping limestone, the shafts of light cutting through darkness. It is here, in silence, that the oldest stories of the Philippines begin. And those stories don't just belong to one people or one migration. They belong to many, to humans and cousins, to the remembered and the lost. Together, they form the foundation of what would become one of the most diverse genetic tapestries on Earth. From the Denisovan legacy in the blood of mountain tribes to the survival of hunter-gatherer ways in remote islands, the first Filipinos show us something profound, that even in isolation, humanity endures. But history is never still. The islands would not remain untouched forever. Beyond the horizon, new forces were stirring. People with tools, crops, and a vision of the sea not as a boundary, but as a pathway. The age of caves and stone tools was ending. A new era was about to begin. Around 4,000 years ago, a new kind of traveler appeared on the horizon. They were not wandering hunter-gatherers. They came with crops, domesticated animals, polished stone tools, and above all, with boats unlike anything the world had ever seen. These were the Austronesians, master seafarers from Taiwan. They carried with them rice, taro, bananas, and pigs. They also carried a language, one that would eventually spread farther than any other in human history, from Madagascar to Easter Island. Their journey southward into the Philippines was not accidental. The Austronesians built outrigger canoes that could ride waves instead of fighting them, enabling voyages across treacherous seas. Some archaeologists even call them the Vikings of the Pacific, but their expansion began long before the Vikings ever existed. The Philippines became their first great staging ground. Archaeological sites in northern Luzon show the sudden arrival of red-slipped pottery, polished adzes, and shell ornaments that match finds in Taiwan. For scientists, these artifacts are like fingerprints, marking the spread of a new culture. But this was not a replacement. The Austronesians did not arrive to empty islands. They encountered the descendants of hunter-gatherers who had been here for tens of thousands of years. Eta, Agta, Ati, and many others. The story of the Philippines is not one of one people conquering another, but of blending, intermarriage, and exchange. Modern DNA confirms this. Every Filipino today carries two legacies: the deep ancestry of those first, hunter-gatherers, and the more recent Austronesian imprint. The balance varies. Stronger Austronesian influence in the lowlands and cities, stronger hunter-gatherer ancestry in the highlands and forests. This blending created something entirely new, a cultural base layer that defines the Philippines even today. From the Austronesians came rice terraces, wet field farming, and a love of the sea. From the earlier peoples came knowledge of forests, wild plants, and survival in rugged terrain. Together, they forged a hybrid way of life. Language was the glue. The Austronesian tongue spread rapidly across the islands. Today, more than 180 languages in the Philippines trace their roots back to this Austronesian origin. Even Tagalog, Cebuano, and Ilocano, spoken by millions, are part of this vast family tree. Imagine the sound of those first Austronesian words echoing on the beaches of Luzon, then slowly spreading island by island, mixing with local dialects, reshaping the way people named the world around them. Every modern Filipino word for rice, for pig, for boat carries within it the memory of that migration. The Austronesians were not only farmers, they were sailors without equal. By navigating with the stars, the winds, and the currents, they spread outward in waves. From the Philippines, they sailed further, to Indonesia, to Micronesia, eventually across the vast Pacific. But it all began here, among these islands. Archaeological finds show their impact everywhere. The Lingling O jade ornaments of the Philippines, carved in intricate double spiral shapes, became symbols of identity and status. They were traded across Southeast Asia, proof of vast exchange networks linking island to island. For the Austronesians, the ocean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Austronesian canoes connected Luzon to Mindanao, Palawan to the Visayas, long before roads or maps. This web of seafaring laid the foundation for the archipelagic identity of the Philippines, a nation of islands, yet deeply interconnected. As the centuries passed, these Austronesian migrants and the earlier hunter-gatherers became indistinguishable. They shared not just genes, but rituals, songs, and stories. The chants sung in mountain harvests, the boat-shaped coffins buried along cliffs, the myths of sky gods and sea serpents, they all carry echoes of this merging. Scientists call this the Austronesian expansion. But for the people who lived it, it was simply life. Planting new fields, sailing new waters, raising children who belonged to both worlds. The Philippines as we know it, its languages, its farming traditions, its island-to-island networks, was born in this era. And yet, this was only the foundation. Other waves would follow. Traders from China, merchants from India, missionaries from Arabia, colonizers from Spain, each would leave their mark. But beneath it all, the Austronesian hunter-gatherer fusion remained, the deep root of Filipino identity. If the first Filipinos gave the islands their blood, the Austronesians gave them their voice, a voice carried in language, in song, in prayer, and in story. Voice that still binds 7,000 islands into one people. But the Filipino story does not stop here. The islands would not remain untouched. New faces, new ideas, and new powers were already stirring beyond the horizon. And in time, those currents would reach the Philippines, carrying not just people but connections that stretched farther than anyone imagined. For centuries, the story of the Pacific was told as if it belonged only to the Polynesians, the great navigators, who sailed across an ocean larger than all the continents combined. But new evidence shows that the Philippines was never just a bystander. It was a crossroads, a hidden thread in that vast Pacific tapestry. Archaeologists and geneticists have found something strange in Filipino DNA, traces that connect them not just to Taiwan, not just to their own islands, but far out into the Pacific. Links to Micronesia, to Polynesia, to voyagers who paddled across thousands of miles of open sea. In fact, modern studies reveal that some groups in the Philippines share unique genetic markers with people as distant as Samoa and Hawaii. It's as if the same ocean highways that carried Polynesians east also carried smaller, forgotten migrations west. back into the islands of the Philippines. The DNA whispers of an exchange that official history forgot. But it wasn't only genes that moved. Long before written history, long before maps, people were already trading across the seas. The waters between Mindanao, Borneo, and Sulawesi were not barriers. They were bridges. Archaeologists have uncovered obsidian tools, jade ornaments, and pottery fragments that could only have arrived by boat. Evidence of a trading world stretching deep into Southeast Asia and beyond. Imagine standing on a beach in the Visayas 3,000 years ago. On the horizon, you might see an outrigger canoe arriving, not with conquerors, but with neighbors. They brought not only goods, but songs, stories, and bloodlines. And piece by piece, voyage by voyage, those exchanges left their mark on Filipino DNA. This chapter of forgotten migrations shows us something profound, that the Philippines was never isolated, never static. Its people were part of an older, wider network, one that stretched from island to island, from the South China Sea to the far reaches of the Pacific. Archaeologists have found porcelain, beads, and coins in the soil of Filipino villages, silent witnesses to those forgotten exchanges. In ancient coastal settlements, shards of Chinese ceramics lie buried beneath the earth, dating back 1,000 years before Magellan ever arrived. These weren't just imports. They were evidence of communities that welcomed merchants, intermarried with them, and blended lives together. Modern genetics confirms what the artifacts suggest. In the DNA of certain Filipino groups are faint, almost ghostly traces of foreign contact. Chinese markers that hint at the mingling of merchant families with island villagers. Indian and Arab signatures that tell of sailors, traders, and migrants who left children behind, even if their names never entered the official records. Some of these traces are so subtle they barely register, just fragments of genes hidden in the background. Yet they speak volumes. They reveal how open the islands were to the world long before they were ever colonized. The Philippines was not a backwater, it was a crossroads. And perhaps the most fascinating part is how little of this appears in the chronicles of kings and empires. You won't find many records of Chinese fishermen settling in Luzon or Arab traders marrying into Visayan families. But the blood remembers what history forgot. In the DNA of modern Filipinos, those faint echoes still sing. But the age of quiet exchanges was coming to an end. For centuries, the Philippines had been a crossroads of traders, neighbors, and voyagers, a world shaped by canoes, monsoons, and open seas. Yet beyond the horizon, a new kind of power was rising. Not merchants, not fishermen, but empires. And when they arrived, they would not come simply to trade or to intermarry. They came to conquer. Imagine the year is 1565. On the shores of Cebu, sails appear on the horizon, not the slender outriggers of neighbors, but massive wooden galleons towering like floating fortresses. Cannons, crosses, and banners of cast steel gleam in the sun. The Spanish had arrived. With them came soldiers hungry for glory, priests determined to save souls, and settlers carrying dreams of empire. For the first time, the islands faced not just trade, but conquest. In the towns, villages, and forests, life was forever altered. Bamboo and nipa shrines gave way to stone churches. Old gods were driven underground, their names whispered in secret, while the sound of church bells rang across the islands. The Spanish brought not only swords, but the cross, forging new faith through baptism, confession, and the rosary. To many, Catholicism was not just religion, it was survival. To resist meant death. To embrace it meant access to power, protection, and status. Yet even as they converted, Filipinos reshaped the faith, blending saints with spirits, fiestas with ancient rituals. But Spain alone could not sustain its empire. Philippines became a bridge, not between Asia and the Pacific only, but between Asia and the Americas. Every year, from the docks of Manila, the galleons set sail, immense ships loaded with Chinese silk, Indian cotton, and spices from the Moluccas. They crossed the largest ocean in the world, reaching Acapulco in Mexico. And from Mexico came silver, soldiers, and settlers, but also chocolate, corn, tomatoes, chili peppers, foods that would transform Filipino kitchens forever. It was not only goods that crossed the sea, but people. Mexican soldiers married local women, leaving behind children with new features, new bloodlines. The Philippines was no longer just an Asian story. It had become part of a global one. Out of this fusion, a new identity was born, the mestizo, Spanish blood mixed with Filipino, Chinese, and Mexican. In Manila, you could walk through Intramuros, the walled city of Spanish nobles, then step outside to Binondo, the world's oldest Chinatown, where Chinese traders married Filipino women. Each marriage, each child, rewrote the story of what it meant to be Filipino. But this mixing came at a price. Beneath the churches and stone walls lay the suffering of the masses, forced laborers building roads and ships, farmers paying crushing tributes, villages emptied by disease brought from Europe. Spanish power was felt most by the poor, but its legacy ran deeper. A hybrid culture, half forged in pain, half in resilience. And yet, even as the empire spread its reach, it never reached everyone. In the highlands, in the far islands, in the shadows of the forests, some peoples remained beyond Spain's grasp, carrying the oldest voices of the Filipino past. For 300 years, the Spanish crown ruled the islands from Manila. Churches rose, towns were built, and new bloodlines were woven into the Filipino fabric. But Spain's grip was never total. The empire stretched across oceans, yet even at its height, there were corners it could not hold. The farther you went from the garrison towns and church bells, the weaker Castile's shadow became. And in those spaces, in the mountains, in the forests, in islands beyond the reach of governors, the oldest ways endured. High in the Cordillera of Luzon, communities like the Ifugao, Kalinga, and Bontoc carved their lives into the earth. When Spanish soldiers tried to climb the slopes, they met fierce resistance. The mountains themselves became walls, protecting these peoples from conquest. Even today, Ifugao rice terraces stand as living monuments, not only to agricultural genius, but to independence. Spanish friars may have baptized the coasts, but they never broke the mountain strongholds. Further south, on islands like Mindoro and Palawan, groups such as the Ngayon and the Palawan lived apart from colonial towns. In the Visayas, small islands shielded fisherfolk from direct rule. And deep in Mindanao's forests, the Lumad tribes preserved lifeways that reach back thousands of years. Geneticists studying these groups have found something extraordinary: traces of ancient DNA that predate the Austronesian expansion itself. In some Negrito groups, like the Ita of Luzon or the Agta of Sierra Madre, scientists have uncovered signals of interbreeding with Denisovans, a mysterious, archaic human lineage. These communities are living time capsules, carrying in their blood echoes of the first migrations into the Philippines over 40,000 years ago. Their rituals, chants, and epics are not just traditions. The hudhud chants of the Ifugao, the healing songs of the Subanen, the dances of the Manobo, they are living testaments, voices that survived the silence of empire. By resisting colonization, these peoples preserved not only their freedom, but the oldest strands of Filipino identity. While cities like Manila were reshaped by Spain and Mexico, the mountains and forests guarded their secrets, echoes of the first humans who walked these islands. And this is the truth: there was never one origin, never one root. The Filipino is not a single story, but a living mosaic, Austronesian voyagers who carried languages across the seas, Negrito peoples whose DNA holds whispers of the earliest humans in Asia, Chinese and Arab traders who stayed and became kin, Spanish and Mexican ties forged in conquest and survival. Even Denisovan traces, remnants of a forgotten species, still linger in bloodlines today. Yet identity is not just measured in genes or chronicles. It is in the songs that outlasted silence, in the rituals that defied empire, in the stories still carried from parent to child. So who are Filipinos? There are many beginnings woven into one, a tapestry of survival, memory, and reinvention, where every face is a story, and every story is a world.